My name is Nadav Almog. I've recently finished my PhD in English literature, and I am the editor of The Typewriter as well as the manager of the Almog Award. Today, we are very honored to have with us author Christy Daugherty. So welcome and thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
For those of you who don't know, Christy Daugherty is a former crime reporter and civil servant. She began writing the Night School series while working as a communications consultant for the Home Office. The young adult series went on to sell over 1.5 million copies worldwide. She later wrote the Echo Killing series, The Secret Fire, with French author Corinna Rosenfeld. Her books have been translated into 25 languages and have been bestsellers in multiple countries. In 2020, the books were optioned for television. So once again, welcome and thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much. I'm really happy to be here to talk to all the writers in Israel. This is thrilling.
Yes, although we can't see them, but we will get at some point questions from them all.
Oh, great.
So let's delve right in. So first question, how did you become a YA writer?
It's so funny. I always feel like most of the steps of my writing career have been a complete accident, and this was definitely one of those accidents. So I became a journalist because I couldn't think of anything to do for a living except write. Like, I'm just not good at anything except writing. I am a catastrophic professional in everything else I've ever tried. And so that was an accident, but a good one. And I was a journalist for years. And then I became a freelance writer by accident because the newspaper I worked for shut down. So I sort of fell out of daily newspaper. And then I became an editor by accident because a friend offered me a job and I needed one, so I took it. I became a civil servant by accident because the magazine I worked for shut down. This is a thing many writers will be familiar with. And then while I was working for the British government, a job I never thought I would do. And I was born in America. So for me, this is like, I've come to a very strange place. And I was working right in the middle of Westminster. I had meetings in number 10 Downing Street. It was all very strange. And I do remember thinking during those few years, one of these, I should write a book because I want to write about this world, but I can't write about it nonfiction because of rules. And so that was the beginning really of night school. I was surrounded by powerful people and people who had grown up with great privilege. And I myself come from a quite a not privileged family in the deep South in America. So to see this world as an outsider, that was the beginning. I thought, what would it be like to be a teenager here? And I had just read Twilight, that had just sort of exploded. And I'd read The Hunger Games. And I think, so I was thinking of writing about adults, but I'd read those books and I thought, what would it be like to be the teenage child of the people I was working with? And that was sort of the beginning, because this is a world their parents have invented and they're going to inherit it. And I remember the helplessness of being 16 and sort of during the Cold War and basically thinking my parents are ruining the world, which I think a lot of young people think. And they're not wrong sometimes. So yeah, that was the beginning of that. So it was never, I'm going to set out to write. I do love teenagers, but I did not set out to write young adult. It just happened, as so many things happen. And then it turned out to be a good thing because I do really enjoy writing about young people.
So your idea for becoming a YA author is let things roll.
I think so. Yes, that's sort of how it worked. It definitely was not a thing I studied or planned for. It was just an accident, a happy accident. And then once I was in that world, once I was writing for this particular, this about these characters, because most of my readers are not teenagers. Most of my readers are in their 20s and 30s and older. And everybody feels like they have to apologize for reading books about young people, which I think is absurd. Would you apologize for reading Romeo and Juliet? Would you apologize for reading Catcher in the Rye? There's no need to apologize. This is a world, if it's done well, they're just interesting books about people. It doesn't matter the age of the person in the book.
Fascinating. How do you think your professional experience influenced your writing? I mean, other than, you working at 10 Downing Street, etc.
Yeah, probably quite a bit, because my first career was as a crime reporter, and I wrote I got very close to a lot of crime scenes in America. I lived in Savannah, Georgia at the time, and worked for a newspaper there. And crime reporters in America get very close to the crime scenes. It's a pretty basic system. It's a race to get to the crime scene before the police, so that you can see what's happened, so that you can then write about it before they tape it off, and you can't tell you nothing, and you can't see. So it is that environment. I encountered a lot of violence and wrote about a lot of violence. I learned to write about death really quite early, and to separate myself from it while also observing. My job was to be the eyes and ears of the readers of my newspaper. And so because of that all probably nestled somewhere in my brain, someplace dark and dangerous. And then I went on with my life and wrote about other things, politics, and then went to work for politicians. And so all of that plays into all my books. Night School is about the children of powerful people and politicians. My new series, number 10, is about the daughter of the prime minister who, encounters a plot to kill her mother. So I do find that murder, crime, and politics sort of play in some way into most of my books.
Do you think in some way your experience of actual crime gives your writing an extra level of vivacity?
Yeah, perhaps. I mean, I know I approach it from the perspective of wanting to be true to the damage it does. I read a lot of books that I find very frustrating because it's not realistic into either the impact of crime on the lives of those around the victims and the criminals. Because everybody around a crime is sucked into that world. They're all damaged by it. Everybody's life is less, whether they're on the side, whether they knew the victim, their families of the victim, or they know the criminal, who's, either way, you find yourself somehow tainted by proximity to that. And so that I want to be true to that. I want to be true to how the ripples in the pond of life that crime causes, and that can lead to these waves that damage lives. So that I'm very clear on, and I often find crime novels gloss over that. They don't capture it properly. So that does probably play into it. And in terms of politics, I always want to humanize it. I find that often books about politicians, and even evil politicians, make them sort of mustache twirling cartoon, characters. And in fact, they're just people. They're human beings, and they have nuance. And one of the things I want people to take from my Night School books, and which some of them do take, is I want them to wonder whether my main characters are always the good guys. Because in my mind, they aren't always the good guys. And I want them to think about whether the people they think of as the bad guys are always really the bad guys. Like, look at the nuance of that. Who's right and who's wrong? It's up to the person who's reading the book.
Mm-hmm. Your first books became sort of an overnight hit. They became a success. And I want to ask whether the success of your first book or your first book series put pressure on you to meet expectations.
It's funny. At the time, I was just, riding that roller coaster. So I don't think I noticed as much. I know I was under pressure to produce books very quickly. And so I was always editing one book and promoting another book and writing a third book simultaneously. I had to quit my job, my day job, because I simply couldn't keep up with all of that and work. It wasn't something I wanted to do. I had to do. And then after Night School, there was definitely what is she going to do next thing? And that's one reason I ended up writing The Secret Fire with Corinna Rosenfeld, because we started writing that series while I was still working on Night School Endgame. So it gave me something I knew I could step into next. And it was similar to night school in that it was character-driven YA, but it was different in that it was fantasy, and I'd never written fantasy before. And it was different in that I was working with another author. So it was just like doing something new without going too far from my sort of comfort zone.
Okay. And we're going to circle and get around back to this subject. But for the time being, I want to ask you, who are your main sources of inspiration?
It's funny. There were definitely books. I mean, reading Twilight, even I know there's been a lot of a revisionist thought on Twilight, but just looking at Twilight for what it was at the time, the phenomenon of it. At first I was like everybody else, my age, I'm not going to read this book. This is a book for children. And it's ridiculous that why is everybody reading this book? What if that book is really good? Maybe I'll just read the book when nobody's listening. That was my sort of journey. So I bought the book and I read it in secret, like many people did. And I read it in about a day. And it was only when I finished it that I thought, I'm not sure I loved that book, but it's been a very long time since I read a book that quickly and just sort of absorbed it like food. Like it was just like water. It was just I spent a lot of time thinking about why that was. And I think it was just that it was a page turner. And I had taken to reading different kinds of books that were recommended to me by, important newspapers and friends who read important newspapers. And it had been a long time since I read a book just for the sheer joy of it, just felt the joy of reading and a story. And Hunger Games was the same. I read Hunger Games on a plane, flying to America to see my family. And I read the first book on the plane, and it was a 14-hour flight. And by the time the plane landed, I'd finished it. And my brother, who I hadn't seen in like a year and a half, met me at the airport. He gave me a hug, and I got in the car and I said, take me to a bookstore. I need to buy the second book in this series, just to stop at any bookstore on the way home. It was that much of an addiction. And so those really influenced my desire to write addictive books, if that's a thing, if that's a subcategory, like thrillers, page turners, character-driven stories. That really influenced that. Other things that influenced me were primarily, weirdly, movies and television. So when I'm stuck writing, it's often TV series I go to. Buffy the Vampire Slayer has fantastic dialogue, very fast, very funny, very dark. And you wouldn't think, because, even for my non-fantasy books, it's not about the vampires. It's about the conversation and how that builds character. That's really important to me. I often build character through dialogue. And there's a series from America called My So-Called Life, which came out in the 90s. I have a box set. And when I need to remember what it's like to be a teenager, I just put that on for an hour. And I just watch, a couple of episodes of My So-Called Life to be reminded of that world. Because even though I write in it and I kind of live in it, I can forget, and we all forget. And I don't think it's the same observing like your own children. If you have teenage children, it's different to watch what another artist has done with teenage life. And that to me is what I get a lot from television, just an obvious, so that sort of thing, both when I'm writing, I find different influences from books and television.
Mm-hmm. And you said that you wanted to write sort of addictive books. That was sort of the thing that you set out to do.
Yeah.
Well, how do you set out to write an addictive book?
Well, indeed. That's the hard part. But saying and doing are two different things. I completely agree. I had a fantastic editor when I first sold Night School in Britain, Sam Smith at Little Brown, who had huge experience in this field. She was the British editor of Twilight. And so she knew very much what I was talking about. And so she taught me a lot about how you approach it. And some of that is through chapter endings. It's where you end your chapters really matter. And if you look at where the chapters end in Night School 1 and where the chapters end in Night School 3, how they end, there's an evolution there of learning. So my chapters in Night School 1 are quite long. They end in really satisfying places for me. Like, that is the end of this section, is the end of a chapter. And that is, it's a technical thing, but that is part of it, in that if you put chapter endings in very smart places, people want to turn the page and keep reading. And that is a technical way to write a more addictive book. So make sure you end on a cliffhangery place, or instead of at the end of a scene, in the middle of a scene, but in a satisfying place in the scene. Like, these are sort of ways to look to make sure the pages keep turning. And the rest of it for me is about balancing really carefully, building characters people believe in and they love, so they feel real to them, so they have this impact on readers. You want to have an impact on readers so that they feel like if something happens to these characters, it happens to them. It's a very cathartic relationship. And if you can do that, so there's an emotional connection between reader and character, then people get more invested in the books. I do this because when I'm reading, this is what I want. This is what I want to read. And if I can't feel a character when I'm reading, I quickly lose interest in the book. And another method is place. So set it in a place where people want to spend time. So if I created a school, Samaria Academy, a night school, where it's just a little bit real and a little bit fantasy in terms of how perfect it is, and how sprawling it is, and what it looks like. And I try to make sure people can see this building that's almost impossibly perfect. And I went to a lot of boarding schools, like, not me, but visited. I went to a school across the street from a muffler shop in Houston, Texas. So to me, any British boarding school is a fantasy setting. These schools really do look like castles. It's not, in fact, some of them are mansion castle houses. Like, it's extraordinary. And so this sort of setting to me was fantastic. And so I think that I could convey that in my writing, and then people want to spend time there. They want to see it. It's a place they want to linger. It's a place I, as a writer, want to hang out. So if they want to stay in your setting, if they want to be with your characters, and if everything is constantly hitting the fan in terms of the plot, there you have the formula, really, for a book people don't want to put down, hopefully.
Mm-hmm. Well, whatever you did, it must have worked, because I think the average time for me to read one of your books is a day.
Amazing.
I mean,
That's perfect. That's what I want.
I pick it up, and a few hours later, I just put it down and I've finished reading it, and the day is gone. Now, you mentioned boarding houses, and I was thinking, what's the deal with British people in boarding schools? It seems like a very repeating theme in many books and book series, especially for YA.
Yes, it really is. And for younger books, I mean, I remember reading books set in boarding schools when I was a child, all British boarding schools. So I read a book called Charlotte Sometimes, about a girl, and that is one of my favorite books of all time. And if you haven't read it, read it. It's one of those books about a young person that an adult can happily lose themselves in. And that, there were other books. There's scenes in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe when they go away to school. It was such a thing that British kids went away to school. I suppose there's a combination as to why it's a thing. I think for young people, there's a kind of delightful terror in the idea of living away from your parents, like having the idea of more freedom. I mean, personally, I would have loved to have gone to boarding school. Loved it. Anything, even though I know it wouldn't have lived up to my idea of what it would be like. And I know loads of people who've been to boarding school in real life who are like, ugh, why would you want to do that? But if you haven't done it, there's something magical about it. And in America, we all go away to camp every summer, and we're away from our parents, and it's the closest equivalent that you would kind of have to that if you're not particularly wealthy. And those weeks spent at summer camp away from my parents, looking back as an adult, were magical. I grew up a lot in those weeks. It was a kind of controlled freedom, really, if that makes sense. Like, for me, it was just this new world. And so, okay, I think there's that element. We all invest in it, our own fantasies of the kind of freedom it would bring. I mean, 200 kids and 20 adults, in a house, that's That's the idea of sort of young people being able to do things on their own, to have freedom, to explore, to grow up. Um, so I suppose that's it more than anything, and also the history of it, the history of fiction, fictionalized boarding schools. Such good books came out of it in the early 20th century, and we grew up with those. So then we all have that bedrock on which we build a boarding school fantasy. We already kind of know it and idealize it. So it's kind of easy to then sort of slip into that world as a writer.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned that you yourself didn't go to a boarding school. So what kind of research, if any, did you have to do in order to write about life in such a school?
It's funny, when I was working for the government, I did work with quite a few people who went to boarding school, so I could sort of pick their minds about what it was like for them. And so I had like the actual people with their own experiences. I remember one of my PRs, what do you call them, press agents, when I was working for with Little Brown, had gone to boarding school, and she told me that at hers they had ponies and they could all go ride their ponies after class. Like, so they would go down from class, and she described this idyllic country estate where they would have class in this old school building, then they'd run down the hill to where the horses were kept, and they'd all, you know, go riding on their horses across the fields. I mean, my goodness, what what a way to go to school. So having the idea that this was real, you know, that they really did do this now. I have spoken at boarding schools where you pass the students' horses on the 1.5-mile private drive up to the main building. Like, it's crazy. It is crazy. There is very little in night school that is entirely out of the realm of possibility. There are elements that I've invented to make it feel more magical, but none of them would be impossible with a little ingenuity. So yeah, I suppose that my research was talking to people who went to boarding school, then physically going to them to do speeches and meet the kids who were there and talk about reading, and at the same time just absorb it, what it's like. At one boarding school I spoke at, I was talking to a teacher for a while who is actually a house mother. So that's in a dormitory. She slept in the dorm with the students and kept an eye on them. And she said some of the students, when they came there, were so, how's the word? They were so protected by their parents that she caught a student trying to open a tin of tomatoes with a knife because she didn't know what a tin opener was. She didn't know a can opener. She'd never seen one. And she said, we have to explain everything. This is how you wash a dish. This is how you make a cup of tea, because they've always had staff to do that for them. So part of what they did at this boarding school was teach very wealthy children how to live on their own. And so, yeah, that world is real.
Mm-hmm. And for example, what kind of more fantastical elements did you invent for the night school?
I think the things like night tennis. So and night croquet, where everything lights up and they play in the dark with glowing tennis rackets and glowing tennis balls, and they have a glowing net, but otherwise everything else is completely dark. So that's just something I'd like to do. I'm not sure if you could do it. Somebody could do it. I have an umbrella that I bought somewhere that has lights all around the outside of it. So when you walk through the dark, if you push a button, the whole umbrella lights up like something out of a circus. So there's nothing you couldn't do. That probably influenced my invention of the night tennis. So if I could have an umbrella that lights up, I could have a tennis racket that lights up, and night croquet. But the rest of it, like the castle ruins at the top of the hill, which people might think is a fantasy, that absolutely happens. That's a thing you will actually find. And the chapel on the grounds, again, that's completely routine. And the old manor house, there's one, it was completely, the look of Cimmeria Academy is basically based on a boarding school near where I live. It's almost identical to that particular school. So it's all real.
Mm-hmm. So if sort of your fantasy would have come true and you would have been able to go to a boarding school, how do you think the experience would have been for you?
Oh, that's a good question. I wonder, because I was quite a shy, and I still am an introvert. I am not comfortable in large groups. I've nothing against them. I just tend to be the person who sits in a corner observing. I'm happiest there. I don't mind being in the group. I just don't want to be in the center of a group. So that's a lot of kids in one place. So I think it would depend on the kids and the school itself, because there are schools where I've spoken where I'm sure I would have fit in pretty comfortably. Um, and then the others I've spoken where I thought, oh my goodness, thank heaven I didn't go to this school. There have been a couple like that. So yeah, I think it would have depended. But at camp, I always did okay. So I tend to believe that taken out of my element and put into a different world. And that's something that I think for many people it's uncomfortable, but it often changes you in a good way. So moving to Britain as an American when I was, in my 20s changed me. It made me a slightly different person. So I think I would have been going to boarding school. Maybe I would have been a little more outgoing. I think I would have done okay.
Okay, cool. Um, What other kinds of research did you have to do to write both the night school books and the Secret Fire?
Well, for night school, I think I did quite limited research. Like I wanted to make up a lot of it. So I wanted it to be as an invention as much as possible. But aside from visiting schools and talking to people, I researched rules about um, like how many teachers might sleep in a school at a boarding school. And this you can get just by going on the websites of various private schools. How much does it cost to send a student there? How long are the terms? This stuff is all like, it was so easily available. I just, I didn't have to do anything particularly extraordinary to find out the basics of how it works. And then for the Secret Fire, I would have had to do a lot of research into the French half of it, because half of it takes place in Paris and half of it takes place in Britain. But my co-writer was Parisian, and so she could do the all the French bit. So everything that takes place in France, or in Paris, she writes, and then everything that takes place in Oxford, I write. And I'd been to Oxford, and we went and walked around Oxford. My husband and I spent a couple of days just sort of walking around the streets and coming up with where we wanted to set things and how, which college to use as the base for it. And that's really easy work. And the rest of it was alchemical symbols, because the Secret Fire is sort of based around the idea of alchemy as a form of actual magic. I mean, that was sort of how we started, was what if alchemists were right? And you really could, and there was magic to be found in the natural world, so boom, let's start from there. And so to do that was sort of the research. Like we used real alchemical symbols. All the symbols on the cover of the Secret Fire are from ancient texts, and the beliefs of alchemists at the time. We read up on those. That was quite fascinating. And then Carcassonne, the place where the Secret City is based. It's a city in the south of France. I actually went to Carcassonne, any excuse, quite frankly, to go to the south of France and spend a week driving around, looking at old villas and old sort of vineyards, and just getting a lay of the land, because much of the second book takes place there. And so it was sort of like that, but then the rest was invention.
Mm-hmm. So did you really have to go into all the texts and whatnot, or is it just like a romantic idea?
It's definitely a romantic idea. We did base it on the ideas, the early sort of very skimming the surface ideas of what alchemists believe. But really, we very much combined what alchemists believe with magic in order to, and magic is invention. So that we just made up.
Okay. One, I think, of the most interesting aspects of writing is co-writing with someone else. So I was wondering, how did your dynamic with Corinna Rosenfeld work when you wrote The Secret Fire? I mean, the specifics of it.
Yeah. It it's funny because when we started, we used to joke about how easy it was going to be for two people to write an 80,000 word book because it's 40,000 words each. No problem. It's not easy. It's really hard. And I've talked to a lot of co-writers about this since, and they've all come up with a structure. Like you have to kind of come up with your own system for how you're going to do it. And for us, we did chapter to chapter, or like I would write one and then she would write the next, and back and forth. And we would, so it goes from the boy's perspective in Paris, Sasha, to Taylor's perspective in the UK. And literally she would send me Sasha's chapter that she'd just written, and I would read it. And then I would write the next chapter, which would be Taylor's chapter, and then send it back to her. And at first that goes quite quickly until you get to the sort of meat of the plot. And so then we did have an outline to work from, but it was quite loose because we both work very loosely with structure. And we didn't always know, most of the time we didn't know what the other person was going to write. So it has a kind of it was almost like a writing exercise. And sometimes like she would send a chapter and I would read it, and she writes in French and then translates that to English. And so to keep things moving, she would send me the French chapter and I would try to read it, then give up and quickly Google Translate it so I could just get the idea of what she'd written so that I could then start writing mine while she was translating her chapter into English, because Corinna's fluent in both languages. And so I was often like reading on my phone at like 1 o'clock in the morning, her latest chapter. And every time I was like, oh man, she set up this like huge cliffhanger that I then just have to pick up. One night I was reading and she'd shot her own character in the face. I'm like, how do I follow this? What happened? Nothing this exciting is going to be happening to my character, because her character was in a very different place in book 1 than my character is in book 2. Like he's very deep and dark into his situation, which is, as you know, that he has basically a family curse that means he can't die until his 18th birthday, when he will die. And because he's 17, he's given up on everything, because what's the point of planning if you know you're going to die on your 18th birthday? And he keeps killing himself because he's trying to break this, this curse that traps him, and he just can't die. So his story is very dark. Well, my character is just sort of blithely walking along through her life, unaware of who she is and that she's the alchemist who might be able to save him. Like so they're in two very different places, and we have to like strike this balance. So yeah, we had to find a way. It took much longer than we thought. So we thought it would take a few months, and it ended up taking really over a year to write one book. It was enjoyable and we both loved it, but we did both find it fascinatingly more difficult than we thought.
Okay. Now, someone from the audience wanted to ask if you can give sort of highlights for co-writing work.
Highlights of, say that again?
Highlights for co-writing work.
Yeah. So basically, we came up with an outline together, just emailing back and forth until we had a very, like, maybe 4-page synopsis for book 1 and the beginning of book 2. Like we knew more or less what we wanted to happen, but not necessarily how we would get there. And then she wrote a first chapter and sent it to me, almost a prologue. And then I wrote a first chapter from my character's perspective in England and sent it to her. And then that almost happened organically. Like we weren't sure how we were going to do it, but once we'd done that, then suddenly it kind of made sense to do it in that way, to write from the different perspectives, a Taylor chapter, a Sasha chapter, unless one of them is too tangled up in something. And then there could be sometimes 2 chapters from a character perspective before it switches back. And we did it without too much. From then on, we decided to do it without too much engagement with each other. So I would say, go write, don't tell me what. Just do your thing. So because we're each so independent as well, we're very independent writers. So it was a way to balance our personal independence with the codependence of writing together, and that she could do anything she wanted with her character, and I could do anything I wanted with my character, and then we would adapt to what the other writer had done. So that's why I say it's sort of like a writing exercise, and that you then had to adjust your expectations for the story based on what the other writer had done.
When you say her character, my character, do you mean that, for example, her character was Sasha because it's French and she's French, and your character was Taylor because she's English and you're English.
Yes, exactly. That's what we decided would be easiest because then she's already in that world. And so the neighborhoods in Paris where he lives are real neighborhoods that Corinna walks through every day. And the city streets that Taylor walks down are real streets here that I have visited many times. So we both felt really comfortable with our settings. And only when Taylor comes to Oxford at a certain point, there's a wonderful awkwardness to it because it's unfamiliar to him as it was unfamiliar to Corinna. So that was really kind of nice. Like she wrote that awkwardness into the book. And when Taylor goes to France again, she's in a foreign country and she's not completely out of her depth, but a little bit. She doesn't always understand what people are saying. She's just a little off balance. And that was intentional to make it feel more sort of real.
Mm-hmm. Now, what would happen if it happened that you were not happy with what Corinna had written, or if Corinna was not happy with what you've written?
I mean, it did happen a couple of times that I was like, one of us would be like, I don't know where you're going with this, or is this going to work because of that? And so, for example, when we first invented our monsters, if you will, who are pursuing them, the first monster she created, I didn't think suited the book. She's the monster inventor. This is Corinna's thing. She's written about 27 fantasy books. That woman can invent a monster in 5 minutes. It's remarkable. And so I thought her monsters were a little not how I'd envisioned them in my head. And so I told her how I'd envisioned the monsters. And she said, let me play with this. And so she went off for about 20 minutes. And then she came back and how about this? And she'd written a description and even drawn a sketch of what became our monsters. And I'm like, that's it. That's perfect. And it was like a mixture of what I'd seen and what she'd seen. And it was so remarkable that she could do that so quickly. So that was we would talk if there was ever a point where I'm like, oh, I don't know. Should we go here yet? Are we ready for this yet? Should we push this back a few chapters? We would then discuss that and rearrange things a bit. But mostly we just went with it. 9 times out of 10, if she did something I wasn't expecting, I thought it was great. It was thrilling. I mean, some of the stuff she came up with, it was just so exciting because to not know where her character was going to go, like where she was, and when they were together, where she was going to take our characters. It was something else to sort of have that unexpectedness in a book you're sort of co-writing.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Moving on to a little different topic. Do you yourself read YA literature? Do you think it's a prerequisite thing for someone who writes YA?
I always think, I mean, to me, it's rule 1 of writing: read the genre you're writing in, read it obsessively, like read it constantly. And so I do. I have. I've read YA. I mean, since Twilight, really, and since before then, when I was younger. So I'm constantly reading old and new YA, and just looking for sort of where the voices are right now. So I do read it. There's certain kinds I don't like, and that's true of any reading. So in crime, because I also write adult crime novels, I don't read serial killer books and I don't write serial killer books. I just don't like them. And in YA, I don't read issue books. You know what I mean by issue books? Books about like John Green style books about cancer or, I don't know, eating disorder books or any of that. That doesn't interest me. I'm a thriller person. So I read all the thrillers. Bring me a thriller in any genre and I will happily read that book. And romance books, I love those as well. But there needs to be some thriller element to it or I get bored. I'm actually quite narrow in my reading. I once tried to write a romance and I got so bored writing it that at about chapter 10, I just put a bomb in it. I thought that would be really exciting. And my agent was like, it's no longer a romance book, Christy. Not if there's a bomb in it. So yeah, I seem to be incapable of straight romances or books about like problems. Those don't interest me as much. And there's a lot of issue books in Britain right now. Everything's very much about, I don't know, things in the world that are wrong, whereas I'm much more of a fantasy crime person. I like things to fly and blow up.
and that brings up a very interesting question. How do you decide on the levels of romance on the one hand and action on the other hand. I mean, do too much of this and it's a romance book. Do too much of this and it's an action book.
Yeah, it's tricky, isn't it? And because romance, I don't ever set out to even write a romance in my book, and then it just always seems to happen. I think I seem to have a romantic streak. I'm always leaning towards at least 75% thriller and no more of the other kind, no more romance than that. Like, I mean, and by thriller, I'm including in their character development and so forth. Like, I'm just taking that as part of the writing of anything. Your character has to be developed in there. But in terms of romance, that has to be, to me, a side story. It's just not exciting enough. And that's not anything against people who like more romantic books. It's simply my own personal taste is for a excitement to keep the pages going. And to me, that comes, if a romance can be exciting, and that can happen if it's an untrustworthy romance, if you're not sure about the other person, those can be quite exciting in a way. And then you can build that up a little bit more, like in the early Night School books, the Sylvan Carter thing. But mostly to me, it's usually the side story. But it's a way to get to the heart of the characters as well. It's a way to see deeper into them.
Okay. Do you think that YA has sort of unwritten rules or arrangements that you can write this, you must write that, you cannot under no circumstances write something like that? Does YA have rules according to which you work?
I think there are rules. I think the rules were very strict when Night School first came out. So in 2011, 2012, I was literally told how many swear words I could have in a book, like literally how many. You could have 0 of the very serious swear words. You could have 1 or 2 of them sort of medium swear words. And you could have like as many as you wanted of the like very low level swear words, like things like that were, and the rules on like sex and how you portrayed it were quite serious. And everything has to have, one of the fundamental rules that I still hear are sex has to have consequences. That's a rule. You can't have sex without consequences. So basically either someone has to get pregnant, or you have to think about venereal disease. You see what I mean? Like, you've got to think about things you would never think about if you were writing an adult book. And birth control, very important. They've got to at least think about it. And if they do something that's wrong, there has to be, if a main character who we're to see as a good character does something thoughtless or wrong or cruel, there have to be consequences for that, or there has to be a reaction to that. They have to learn from it. At least certainly this is how publishers see it. So there's a bit in Night School 2, for instance, when Allie says something quite cruel about Zoe, not even very cruel, just a little thoughtless, borderline cruel about Zoe Glass, who has Asperger's syndrome. And we're kind of gathering she has Asperger's. And it's the first time Allie meets her. And she makes a kind of a joke about it. And I'd thrown it in there because that's how Allie is. She doesn't know yet. And it was my intention that later in the book, she would learn and grow closer to Zoe, and their relationship would become what it does become. And my editor, when she read it, the first thing she said was, either she can't say that, or someone has to call her up on it. And she needs to learn from this. And so there's no like slow learning. In YA, the learning has to be quite quick. There's an immediate reaction and immediate, oh, I'm sorry. And that does not necessarily reflect real life. And when I was writing, I always wanted to, as much as I could, reflect what it was like to be a teenager. And teenagers learn at the same pace as adults. We make mistakes over and over again. We learn from that eventually, but we don't always immediately learn. But in YA, you really can't get away with that. So yeah, there are definite rules, but they're tiny, almost societal rules. So it's something that I am, sorry, that was my FaceTime. It's something that I learned, and now I do sort of automatically. But when I write adults, I revel in the awfulness of characters. I just let them be horrible and have no consequences. And then, you know, eventually consequences.
Yes. And another interesting question. You said that you didn't really learn how to write. I mean, you didn't go to writing meetings and whatnot.
Yeah.
So when and how you sort of came to the conclusion, this is it, I'm a writer?
Such a tough one, isn't it? Okay, because I'd always written nonfiction, I'd been a journalist. So I'd learned the basics of word order and smooth writing. I learned that with nonfiction. Journalism is about writing concisely. You have very limited space and you've got to convey very complicated things. I've had to describe a murder scene in 175 words before, and that's all I had. That is literally the space that I had to work with. And that was good teaching. And it was also writing under pressure. So I usually had, like, I would basically deadline on my first job was midnight, and murderers don't care what time it is. And I have gone to crime scenes at 11:30, raced back to the newspaper with 10 minutes to spare before the paper goes to press, written while my editor is literally editing over my shoulder, and then, and had 15 minutes to describe a complicated shooting scene, and with quotes from witnesses and police officers. So that was all my training. And so in terms of creative writing, well, that's a different world, obviously, because how you structure the novel and how you build character, these are things people definitely study, which I could have done, except I'm really bad about going to school. So I learned by reading books, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of books, and seeing the ones where they built the character so well that I believed the character, and then reading that book 5 times to try and understand the nuts and bolts of how they did it until I could deconstruct that book down to, like, basically the method they'd used to build this in a way that I didn't notice it was building until I felt so invested in these characters and this person at the heart of it. So to me, that is the ultimate training. It depends on if you're like me, if that's how you learn better. Some people, I have nothing against creative writing courses. They're incredibly good. And I know amazing writers who've come out of that. But I'm not good in a structured environment. So the last thing I ever want to do is go back to school. I'm very much a self-trained person. So yeah, that's how I did it. And to know when to know if the book was good. I mean, the first couple of times I wrote books, they were awful. And you do know, I did know. I knew by chapter 8. I've never tried to write a book and not known by chapter 8 whether it was going to work or not work. I get to chapter 8, that's what, 15,000 words, 16,000 words maybe. And you can feel it. Do you feel this book or do you not feel this book? And when you read it, do you want to write more as a writer? Are you enjoying where the story is going? If you don't want to write more, and if you can't feel the drive towards the end of it, it's not there. And that's when I usually stop, throw it away, start over, rethink, begin again. And that's something I still do today. I mean, I did it with the book with number 10, my new series. I did it with the book I've just written, which is the second book in that series. Because I'd written the beginning of it, then I had to stop because the world kind of ended when coronavirus happened. I just couldn't write anything for the first couple of months of that pandemic. March, April. When I went back to it in May, I just threw out everything I'd written before. It wasn't working. And I started over at a different point. And then it came together. So sometimes it is about knowing when you're beat, when you just don't have it, and just letting that go. And then thinking back to the drawing board, where do I start now?
And that's another excellent question. How did the coronavirus affect your writing and your writing process?
Oh my God. It was just so weird. And what I'm finding is, now that I'm in my 8th year of novel writing, is if the world sort of goes crazy, it's really hard to focus. It was just, and I would sit in front of my computer just like it was a normal day, because what I didn't want to do is sit in front of the television watching the bad news. But nothing happened. Like, the words were false. I would write 200 awful words and just delete them and think, well, that was pointless. And then go back to watching the bad television. And I talked to other writer friends just to find out if I was alone in this. because I have deadlines. We all have deadlines. But then again, our publishers had just all shut down. So did we have deadlines anymore? Like, what was going to happen? And what I found was nobody was writing. In those first few months, nobody was writing. And it was very comforting in a weird way to know we were all in that together. And from then on, I gave myself a pass. And what I did instead was edit. So I went back to editing a previous book, which I needed to do because it was going to go out on submission later. So this is a new adult crime book I'm working on. And I worked on that. I rewrote it. That I could do. Editing uses a different part of your brain. It's more, I always say it's mathematical as opposed to magical, which is the writing part, which uses like the dreaming part of your brain. Editing is very practical. It's like, does this word structure work? Is chapter 13 okay? Like I could focus on that level of it. But in terms of completely inventing story in setting and character, that is so, it requires such concentration. And that wasn't there. And it wasn't there for months. I mean, March, April, May, I didn't really write anything new. It was late June, when I found I could write again and got back to it. And so since then, I've been writing as much as I can because I had 2-3 projects on the go. And so the pressure of being so far behind really helped push me out of the weirdness of coronavirus and get me back on my writing feet.
Mm-hmm. But in terms of, for example, books that were meant to come out or are still meant to come out, considering that bookstores are closed for the most part, does that somehow influence the industry, the writers themselves?
Oh yeah, it was very strange because it felt like writing into a void. Like, am I writing for anything? When is anything going to happen? And what I had to do, what I think all writers have to do now, is just put that out of your mind. Like you always have to do when you're writing. Early on, it was impossible because everything was unknown, and there was so much happening at once. So much, it was very scary. You know, it did feel like there was no vaccine, there was no hope for a vaccine, so it felt very permanent. Now there's hope. So now you have to just make certain assumptions. This is what I'm doing. I mean, all my books have been delayed for indefinitely. Like I do have dates for some of them, but in some countries I don't have dates even for when they're going to come out. And I'm just accepting this. And that is fine. I'm still writing forward. So if you're writing a book now, there's almost no way that's going to come out for the next 2 years anyway, in the best of times, because you've got submission to publishers, then editing, and then pre-publication, so forth. So you're expecting 2 years anyway. So tell yourself, I'm writing for 2 to 3 years from now. The world will be fine then. Bookstores will be open. It will be a beautiful future. There'll be peace across the land. Tell yourself that until you believe it, and then let yourself write. That's the only way to do it. That's what I'm doing. Just assume things are going to get better.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. We have a couple of questions from the audience. Yes, we have audience, even though we can't see them. One viewer asked, why did you decide to use a stage name or an author, a pen name? And why did you choose that particular name, CJ? And where did the J come from?
I think this person knows that the J is imaginary. It's what I always say. The J is imaginary because it's not my middle initial. Okay, so I decided to go with CJ in part because my name is quite long. It's just across the book on a paperback. It just takes up a lot of space. And so it was just an idea at the time. There was something quite nice about not using my own first name. As well, the mystery of being someone else was quite attractive. I quite like that. I wish I'd written under a pseudonym entirely. I have a friend who did, and I'm so envious because she has these 2 lives, like her author life and her private life are completely separate. And that's kind of fun. That would be, I don't know, there's something quite pleasing about that, something mysterious. I didn't really go that far, so it was kind of pointless. But it is useful because it means when I write adult fiction now, because I also write crime novels that are purely adult, then I can use my real name. I use Christy for those. I use CJ for my YA most of the time. And that delineates, in a way, for me and for readers which book you're reading. So that was practical. And yeah, so in a way, there was almost no real reason to do it except for the length of my name and the fact that it was kind of trendy. And I quite liked CJ as a thing you could actually call me. Like, it's not like, CD. Who was, hey CD, come over here, but CJ, it sounds really cool. So yeah, it was it was just dipping my toe in the direction of having a pseudonym without going all the way in, because I don't know why. I didn't
But
just
then
bravely
again,
do it.
if you have a pseudonym and you're anonymous, then you can't have interviews like this
Yes.
because you're anonymous.
Because then you'd see my face and you'd know.
Yeah.
True.
Another question that came in is, do you have any updates about the TV series that's planned?
Yes. I'm sorry, the pandemic has ruined so many things. But one thing was, like, literally on the day they closed down Los Angeles, a meeting was scheduled with one of the biggest streaming companies in the world about this. And then everybody went home. That was like, this is my luck. Welcome to my luck. So it is still optioned. The producer is still promoting it and taking it around. I'm still very optimistic, but everything is so slow in Hollywood now, the same way it's slow in publishing. Everything has been pushed back that was already scheduled. So they are buying new books and they are making new series, but just much more slowly than they would have if the world had not gone mad. So I'm still hopeful. We still, every day is a possibility. But right now it's like everything's just pushed back. So let's think next year, bright future. Everything's going to be fine.
Yes. And another question that just came in: which contemporary writers do you recommend reading and rereading as a learning experience?
Yeah, that's such a good question. I reread a book called The Secret History by Donna Tartt, which is one of the books that made me want to write crime in the first place. And also, it's set in a private university, but it's very much like a boarding school. It's very big influence on me when I was writing Night School. That atmosphere she creates of a cut off, dark place, it's magical. That book, it's such a pleasing, tightly written crime novel. And I would say this, much as I love Donna Tartt, nothing else she's ever written has been pleasingly tightly written. So that was a one-off, but I love it. I read it a lot. There is an Irish writer named Tana French, who I read all of her books. They are not tightly written, but they are beautifully written. And her character development is just so pleasing. A book called The Likeness is one that I have read 4 times in the last few years, just to sort of see what just to remind myself its setting, its character, and it's this idea of crime that is often forgotten in the story. It's just so pleasing. I highly recommend that, although my mother-in-law hated it, and so I usually trust her judgment, so I don't know. Now it's made me doubt it. In terms of non-crime, The Night Circus is a fantasy book that I was blown away by. It's not my style of writing, but I really like reading outside of my own style, just to see what someone else is doing and how they're doing it. And it's just such a pleasing invention of place and character, and it just makes me really happy. So those are 3 books I highly recommend reading more than once. And in terms of young adult, I've read the Cassandra Clare Mortal Instruments series several times for her fluid writing style, and her action and her love story combination is just so light and airy in that series. It makes me happy, and I'm always hoping to absorb some of that skill she has in that particular series. And there's a Holly Black book called The Coldest Girl in Cold Town, which is just my really brilliant look at vampires from a completely different perspective that is just so marvelous, and it looks at our own society and through there. It's just fascinating, that book. And I've read that one several times as well, just for how did she do it, and how did she create that dark world. It's very pleasing. And so those are some that I reread quite frequently.
And I hear that Cassandra Clare and Holly Black write together.
Yeah.
Maybe actually meet and write together.
Yeah, exactly.
Would you like to join?
Well, if they would have me, I would be honored. That's a group of very talented writers. that I admire all of them. So I would be thrilled to be, even though I don't usually do writing groups, because I always find no writing gets done in writing groups. It's just lots of talking. And I'm always so like, I've been on a couple of writing retreats and I just hide myself in a room and I really write. I once wrote 10,000 words or 20,000 words in like a week at a writing retreat, but I didn't meet anybody. There were like 15 or 20 people there, and I was just in this room writing the whole time. And then at dinner, I didn't know who anybody was because all day long I was just writing. So I'm really bad at writing retreats because all I do is write.
Okay. I think that we're running out of time, but I do want to ask you at least one final question for those in the audience who want to write YA too. What would be your tips for those of our viewers at home who want to write YA?
I mean, number one is just read lots of YA. Find the books you like and the ones you don't like, and figure out why that is. Why don't you like the ones you don't like? Why do you like the ones you like? And what can you learn from the ones you like? That's just basic rule to writing in any genre. My personal rules beyond that are don't ever write down to young people. Don't assume they're young. Most of your readers will probably be adults if you're lucky. So lift them up. Remember that teenagers are reading Shakespeare in school. They're reading Chaucer. They're reading, the greatest writers of our like history. They can handle complicated thoughts. Let them challenge them a bit. I don't write much differently for young adults than I do for adults, aside from those basic rules that we've discussed, which I always try to remember. But generally don't talk down to them. Trust them to come with you to a complicated place. But make your teenagers real teenagers. Teenagers are not adults. They're different, and they are more accepting of things that we wouldn't accept. They will take chances we would not take. They will do irrational and dangerous things. They'll just do them because they think they're going to live forever. Always remember that they think they're immortal, and don't put your own knowledge of mortality onto them. This is the magic of teenagers. We should have more of that in our lives. It's one of the reasons it's a joy to write about them, because they take risks that we have learned are not a good idea. And so let them take those risks and go with them down that path. Don't try to make them adults. Don't make them prudes. Make them real. Make them irreverent and dangerous and sharp and smart and canny and more sophisticated than any adult thinks they are, because they just are. And once you do that, you'll find like many vistas open in terms of writing. There's many things you can write about. And take some chances. There's not enough chance taking in young adult fiction right now. It is quite, I want to see more risks being taken in terms of what's written. Let's open it up again and make it a little more of a wild genre. I would love that. I would love to see more of that. So yeah, go dive in. Just don't worry too much about it. Write about them. Remember what it was like to be a teenager. Remember the stupid, crazy things you did. Think about that. And then sit down and write that book.
Mm-hmm. What examples could you give us of crazy things that you would have liked to see that you don't see normally in YA?
I'm reading a book right now that's not published, that a friend of mine has asked me to read, that is set in an apocalyptic Texas. It's sort of like a fantasy of a future which has seceded and has fallen completely to pieces and is sort of overrun by gangs of motorcycle bandits. And it's completely believable. It's extremely dark and unpredictable. And the characters are in real danger, and the adults can't be trusted. And so that kind of world, that kind